The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I too want to speak today in memory of one of Australia's finest, Ian Kiernan. And I think that all Australians were saddened yesterday to learn of his death from cancer at the age of 78. Ian Kiernan is appropriately revered by Australians of all walks of life in every part of our continent. But it's fair to say that he had a special place in the hearts of residents in my own electorate of North Sydney. And I say that for two reasons. Firstly, Ian was a long-standing resident in Kirribilli in the North Sydney electorate and was well known as one of our great local identities. But just as importantly, Ian's great passion, which started that movement which was to become the focus of his life, began in his love and respect for Sydney Harbour and its natural environment. As we've heard, Ian started his life as a builder, and his other great passion was as a yachtsman. And that passion took him around the world, particularly as a solo sailor. But it also took him on 6 occasions to Hobart as part of the Sydney to Hobart yacht race. That experience of being a yachtsman, sailing the world's great oceans and seas, helped reinforce Ian's passion for our incredible marine environment. But it also helped reinforce his passion for doing something to protect that environment, because on those sailing races, he discovered that great scourge even back then, which has only become worse in the period since, and that was the impact of pollution and waste on our marine environment. When he returned to Sydney after one of those races, he was determined not to simply sit by and idly wonder whether something could be done. He determined that something would be done, and he'd helped lead the movement to do that. And of course, in 1989, he started that process with what was meant to be a small event about protecting and improving the beaches around his own then suburb of Mossman. So he planned a Clean Up Mossman Day. But such was the enthusiasm of Sydney-siders for this initiative that it quickly became apparent that there wasn't enough waste even in Mossman that the 40,000 volunteers he'd amassed would be needed for. So overnight, Clean Up Mossman became Clean Up Sydney Harbour. And of course, Sydney-siders and all Australians were captivated by the motivation that he provided. And just a year later, Clean Up Australia was born with 40,000 volunteers. As part of that, Clean Up Australia and Ian created one of those advertising jingles which sticks in the mind like many of the greats. Of course, Yucky Yucky Poo became part of the Australian lexicon. I'll spare the Federation Chamber my attempt to give a rendition of it today, but needless to say, it is one of those jingles that has stuck in the minds of so many Australians ever since. So from 40,000 to 300,000, and then just a couple of years later to 30 million people who joined in Clean Up the World, which was his attempt so successfully to take his campaign global. Of course, Ian's contribution was recognised very quickly, and in 1994 he became Australian of the Year, and what a fitting tribute to his work that was. Ian's contribution was really one that actually changed the mindset of a generation about our individual capacity to act to protect our own environment. It's fair to say that when Ian started his crusade to reduce the impact of waste and pollution, the marine environment around Sydney in particular was something different to that which it is today. All of us remember vividly the campaigns to try and eliminate the discharge of raw sewage into the ocean just off our magnificent world-famous beaches. And it's fair to say that litter and waste was an issue that affected beaches and waterways around Sydney. In fact, it was a brave person that dived into the waters off most Sydney Harbour beaches back in those days. But what he did teach us was that we could act as individuals, and he really led a people power movement to improve our environment. Because what Clean Up Australia and Clean Up the World did was remind us firstly that our own actions, in isolation which seems small and inconsequential, when combined together both can create a problem, but when we're part of the solution, we can solve those problems as mighty as they might have seemed to Australians at the time. So Ian really motivated a generation which has seen millions of Australians join together to try and improve our environment. Of course, the problems that he identified, as I alluded to, exist today and, frankly, despite all of his efforts, have grown worse. And I hope that the legacy of Ian's life is that we all renew our resolve to act both within our own borders, but more importantly globally, to try and reduce the impact of marine pollution, particularly plastics, on our marine environment. We know that this is a growing problem, and we know it's particularly a problem in our own region, because so much of the plastic pollution entering our oceans is doing so from nations and river systems just in Southeast Asia. And we've seen the consequences of that on the incredible marine ecology of the oceans that border Australia, the Indian and particularly the Pacific. And when there are now estimates that by 2050, the weight of plastic pollution will exceed that of all marine life, we know that we have an enormous task ahead of us. So I hope that as we reflect on Ian's incredible life, that we do renew our commitment as Australians, but as world citizens, to make sure that his goal, to make sure that we tread lightly on this incredible planet of ours, is one that comes to fruition. So I pay tribute to Ian Kiernan, but particularly want to obviously extend my condolences to his family, to Judy, to Sally and Pip. I know that they will have some consolation from the recognition that Ian's work has been receiving over the last 2 days, although nothing obviously will take away from the extraordinary personal loss that they are feeling this week. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.